So welcome everyone. Today we have the pleasure to speak with Carl Ireland, who is the head of regulatory risk at J-Wing. As we all know, SS123, which is the new guidance on model risk from the Bank of England, has gone live since last month. So from his current position at J-Wing, I think that Carl has really a front seat, or I hope that Carl has a front seat on understanding how UK banks are currently working with this new set of rules. And in that context, I'm sure this will be a very interesting discussion. So first of all, thanks a lot, Carl, for being here, for joining us. So let's get started. When did you get into contact with model risk management, first of all?
So I've been actually doing model risk management now for almost 20 years, which is it's a long time. So obviously my current role with J-Wing.
Time to celebrate, right?
yeah. So my current role with J-Wing I've been doing for about 7 years. So before that, I worked for the Co-op Bank, and sort of that was setting up model risk management frameworks and doing model validation. That was in sort of finance and treasury. But even before that, before I worked for the Co-op Bank, I actually didn't even work in financial services. And there, so I worked in manufacturing and in the defense industry, sort of using data science to build models in simulation and build financial models. And so that was building and also validating and checking other people's models, which obviously is what we see today as model risk, although obviously the expectations and the sort of the way that organizations approach model risk has changed significantly over that time. So it's been quite an interesting journey to go on to where we are today compared to that.
Yeah, and that's interesting actually to see that you started in model risk management, basically more from, say, the engineering point of view, working at manufacturing and in data science, generally speaking. I heard a similar story from Agus Sugianto, who also started his career at Ford. Clearly, when they were building models there, they weren't thinking about really model risk as a regulatory requirement, but more as an engineering practice, basically. Right?
Yeah, well, it's always been something that I think a certain group of people within an organization are very, very interested in. So if you're kind of building models or responsible for the people building models, you understand that the risk that's inherent with them. So I think that the big evolution we've seen is how do we get everyone else interested in model risk as well, which
exactly.
is no spoilers, but that's we'll talk about that as we talk about the new regulation.
Exactly what we are trying to achieve here, indeed. So you are head of regulatory risk at J-Wing. No, regulatory risk, it's a big word. So what are the main aspects of your role? Could you
yes, well, so my practice supports all our clients with any and all aspects of regulatory risk, which is a big topic. So whether that's kind of their day-to-day process and compliance work that they do across the regulatory space, or looking at upcoming regulatory change and how to manage it, how to run projects to manage that change, looking at the impacts. And we do that across prudential risk. So we do a lot of work with capital requirements, so IRB modeling. We do an awful lot in model risk, and whether that's governance, control frameworks, or doing independent model validation. We support firms to run ICAP, ILAP, recovery and resolution planning, and stress testing that goes with that as well. So it's quite a broad range across prudential risk, but also on the conduct side as well. So we do a lot of supporting firms thinking about consumer duty, thinking about the vulnerability of their customers, and then also across regulatory reporting. So how do they manage their data? How do they gather their data together and then send that onto the supervisory bodies that request it from them? So we've got a really, really brilliant team of experienced consultants and also a really strong analytical team, and we've been working on problems in these areas for a long time now, and we've done that for lots of different clients. So we've been working with sort of globally systemic banks, but also some of the smallest banks in the UK. So it's a very, very diverse set of clients, looking at very simple business models to more complex sort of international focused firms across multiple regulatory regimes. And also looking, between banks, building societies, and then also sort of working with non-bank lenders who don't have prudential risk requirements, as they're not regulated by the PRA, but do have all the same conduct challenges. Then also from the sort of traditional banks, looking at challenger banks, we're working with digital-focused banks. So yeah, it's quite an interesting sort of diverse set of projects we've been working on. And I guess my role is about helping our clients to understand what their specific regulatory problems are, and then using all the wonderful experience we've got in our teams, so across our consultants, our analytical teams, we've got a great data management practice as well, to help them sort of solve these issues. So most of the work comes from, I think, from regulatory change. And obviously that's what we're going to talk about today, is the new regulation in model risk. And so that's driven an awful lot of our work recently, and that's what we've been busy with. So we've done a lot of supporting firms with their IRB projects as they've built new models and validated new models, looking at how the firms are changing their frameworks and governance to adapt to the new regulation, and supporting with independent model validation, particularly in IRB, particularly with the more complicated credit models, so IFRS 9 and the like.
Okay, well, it's definitely lots of work and lots to discuss about, for sure. So indeed, you already mentioned it a few times, this SS123 guideline. It's been around now for some time already, so people have probably had the time to study it. But if I would be someone new looking for, say, the specific differentiating factors, say, of SS123, what would these be? So what are really the important aspects of SS123, and then especially the ones that maybe stand out a little bit or are a little bit new when we look at, say, guidelines across the globe?
Okay, that's interesting. So I think SS123 as a supervisory statement and a set of principles that banks and building societies and other lenders are expected to work towards. It highlights that model risk is very, very important. It highlights the focus from the PRA on this, and it's something that the scope of the regulation, the scale of the regulation shows that it's something that needs to be kind of considered as its own risk in its own right. Okay, so without going into lots of detail about what's specifically in the regulation, it's 5 principles. It talks about what model risk is, what a model is, how do you identify those, what governance do you need to control model risk, what guidelines you need to give your model development teams to build and manage those models, how do you independently assess whether the models are working correctly, and if something goes wrong, what do you do about it? How do you manage that? Now, in theory, there isn't anything new in there. This is something that anyone who's been doing model risk over the past 10, 15, 20 years, all the same principles in there that we should be familiar with. But what I would say is the new regulation here significantly expands the scope of that. So that has been done now. There's a very clear definition of a model. And when you look at that definition in isolation, it's quite broad. And when you try to apply that definition to what you have it within your business, you can capture an awful lot of things in there. So as well as that, there's a problem or a difficulty that we've always had in the past when defining models is kind of things that sit between, that maybe don't quite meet the definition of a model, but are still quite complicated and still deserve their own sort of recognition. And you need some controls and some management around what do you do with the risk of those. So these are also identified in the regulation called deterministic quantitative methods. And the idea being that they should also be captured, understood, recorded, and there should be something in your framework about how do you manage these, reflecting maybe that the risk isn't quite as severe as it is with a model that's producing estimates, but they are important for decision making, and the risk of them not being used properly, it could be serious. Mm-hmm. So with that, the growth in the sort of the scale, also thinking about the additional controls and governance that will be required. So there's a growth in expectation of who is involved. There's extra responsibilities given to the most senior leaders in an organization. And the idea being, and also that this will make sure that more people are involved with model risk and more people are thinking about and managing model risk. And so a good way of looking at this is currently, obviously, we know lots and lots about this when we talk to credit risk teams, credit analytics teams. So they're already very familiar with their requirements, but this regulation, because of the growth and because of the scope, this pushes this into lots of new areas where we may not have seen model risk management before. So yeah, we could use an example of, you might go into your HR function and they may have some, you may not immediately think that's somewhere that does modeling, but we've seen, for example, some sophisticated statistical techniques when estimating executive remuneration, right, which might not be something that's traditionally captured under a model risk framework, but now needs to be.
Yeah.
And so I guess also it brings in an interesting conflict whereby you may have had areas of your business who've been happily managing away for years and years and years, using the same models to manage their business. Then all of a sudden you're turning up with this greatly increased set of expectations and asking them to do more governance, to have their models independently validated and to apply all these extra controls. So it's a material shift for a lot of the business.
Yeah, I imagine, and to your point, you probably very often then start discovering a lot of new models where also in business lines where people have never really thought very much about model risk management in general. And like detecting all those models often is a challenge, I believe, especially nowadays where almost every product now comes with, say, an AI layer or flavor
Yeah.
embedded in it. And then we get to third-party model risk management, which is a topic on its own and also important in the context of SS123.
Yeah.
But then indeed, yes, I fully agree as well with you that as the inventory grows in size, it becomes more and more complex, or at least operationally burdensome to manage the models. And that's hopefully where I believe technology can definitely help. We had another guest here in the webinars who talked about preventative controls, like trying to achieve, for instance, like almost compliance by design. What I mean, a good example here is that if, say, you are deploying models with a certain automation pipeline, for instance, that pipeline would verify that the model is actually properly documented and vetted in the model risk management system before it can be deployed. So yeah, we see lots of discussions around those topics as well. And I guess that's all related to the fact that the inventory grows and the complexity has increased, right? And do you think this is like a general feature, the fact that, say, new regulation often leads to, say, more complexity, or have you also seen regulations who led to, say, more simplification? That would be kind of nice, I guess.
Yeah, it would, and I think unfortunately, whenever you introduce new requirements, there's more to do. Inevitably, the additional regulation is designed to manage a problem that either existed or something systemic that was there that's not being managed well enough. So yeah, I think that generally new and more regulation leads to more complexity and more work. However, I think it can be there's a distinction that can be made with how the regulation's applied and making sure that there's a way of applying that proportionally, because it's very easy to be very heavy-handed. Yeah. But I think certainly making sure that it can be applied in a way that again it's principles based, that can be taken and can be adapted to each individual circumstance. It's very difficult to produce regulation that is effective and is suitable for everybody. Particularly, you look at financial services, and I talked about the range of clients that we work with, where from the sort of biggest to smallest bank, they may all be affected by similar regulation, but there's a huge difference in the size of their teams, the complexity, and all these other and the risk that's present by them being in the market, and so that should be reflected in the expectations.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I guess you have this type of this proportionality when it comes to the size of the institution, but simultaneously, you also have almost like proportionality when it comes to the amount of risk that a single model represents, right? And then we start talking about model risk itself.
Mhm.
So one aspect here is how to define model risk, and then
Mm.
obviously related to that as well is once you have, say, defined model risk itself, then probably your model risk management practice will depend on the amount of model risk that a given model or given entry in the model inventory represents, right? And there is a certain proportionality there as well. Could you comment on that as well a bit in the context of SS 123?
Yeah. I think it's a good. You mentioned the definition of model risk, which I think is important too. I think that's a key factor in what this is trying to do, and where we're trying to expand the way that the model risk is managed and make more people to understand it. So actually, that starting point, the definition of what model risk is, it's not particularly well understood on a broad basis within firms. So I would say that if you ask most people what model risk is, they would say, do your sums add up? Is the maths right? Is there a fundamental mistake within the model that you're doing? Right, and that absolutely is model risk. Obviously, if you think about some of the headline things that you might see news articles on, is where a firm somewhere's got put a minus sign in a calculation somewhere, and they've cost themselves £500 million for some reason. That's a huge model risk, and obviously there's lots of controls to manage that. Now, that is only one sort of part of the puzzle, I think, here. So the second part is thinking about uncertainty, right? So even where we've got a model that works exactly as it's intended, it's been through a review process, and we're happy that there's no material mistakes in the calculations. We know the data that's used is appropriate. The assumptions and everything else are all they're all well thought out. Even in that situation where a model is getting sort of the green light from your model risk function, it still is just that it's a model. It's an imperfect representation of the real world, and so because it relies on assumptions and simplifications, it's going to have an impact on the end result, and that's uncertainty. So considering that uncertainty as part of decision making, and making sure that people are understanding that a really important part of managing model risk is considering results and ranges, and considering that and discussing that as part of key decisions, particularly for your most material models, is very important. And I think that is something that firms will need to adapt, and that's one of the key changes, and that's probably one of the more difficult changes to make as part of this regulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's that I definitely agree with this. If you look at other frameworks, for instance, in the US, or like SR 11.7, or also the National Institute of Standards AI risk management framework, for instance, then very often they also start with, say, the different components, like the probability of an incident happening times its exposure, basically would be also a starting point of defining model risk. Then if we think at risk tiering, or how it is traditionally done, I guess many people start with, say, estimating or trying to quantify somehow the complexity and the materiality of the different models, and based on that, then come up with a model risk tier. We've also seen plenty of other approaches, like where you maybe have more quantitative features, but also qualitative features. What I mean is, like, the complexity of a model, I would almost say this is like more a qualitative feature of that model, and that would be something that doesn't evolve very quickly over time. On the other hand, you might have issues such as, say, the data quality that flows into a model that is used in, say, near real time, that somehow the level of data quality, or the amount of the effectiveness of the controls to catch issues with the data itself, that might be more quantitative aspects
Mhm.
that go into it, right? And like in valuation models, and you have all these very nice mathematical theories of quantifying the amount of model risk as well. So we've seen all of those different approaches. What do you think is, say, a good, solid approach in the context of SS123? And I guess it will depend a bit on the size of the institution as well and the complexity of their model portfolio. But generally speaking, what are, according to you, say, good approaches?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic because so when you're sort of quantifying model risk and quantifying the sort of materiality of something, when you're looking at a group of similar models, there are good defining ways of doing that. So you talked about sort of valuation models, or it's the kind of models that you'd see in maybe investment banks, sort of pricing derivatives or whatever it is. So there are there's quite nice defined ways of thinking about sort of value at risk or other approaches. So I think the new regulation brings in additional challenges actually, because as we widen the scope and we look about more models, actually setting a framework for exactly how to define materiality and how to quantify the outcome is difficult, because you're looking at a real variety of different things that are modeling different things, measuring different outcomes. And so yes, I think that what the regulation does is give a good sort of starting point for that. So you're looking at the size of the models, you're looking at complexity, you're looking at how easy it is to update and how easy it is to control and maintain and manage. And again, if we go back to the idea that the regulation is principles based and it's sort of up to the individual organization, I think to set that's something that's suitable for their own business model. Like if you've got lots and lots of the type of models you just described, you can be quite sort of specific and you can quantify that, and you can look at answers in ranges. If you've got, a smaller organization might have a governance committee that's looking at 5 or 6 different types of models from different areas, and talking about those in a consistent manner is quite difficult, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's a challenge, and it will probably, and I would imagine the hardest part probably is the comparison, right? Or finding a way to normalize risk in such a way that you can compare different business lines. To your point, if you're working in HR, or if you are working, say, in the investment banking sector, then clearly it's like 2 completely distinct fields. But ultimately, you still need to be able to compare the overall level of risk to see, to decide how you want to manage it. Okay. I guess since we are talking a lot about the fact that we need to involve many more people who are using all kinds of different models, I think a very important aspect as well is the cultural aspect of model risk management, right? You also mentioned that as part of SS123, it's very important to have like senior management buy-in. So I assume that, say, in this case here, the supervisory statement really tries to accommodate a shift in culture and making sure that everyone in the organization is aware of this new type of risk. So here we're talking more about how to change an organization and how to make everyone aware. What are like good approaches for this, according to you?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I think that the sort of topic of culture has been a key piece of feedback or guidance that the PRA have offered. The PRA have been really great, sort of engaging with the firms that are impacted by SS123. They've sort of attended a number of talks and given a number of discussions, and the sort of one of the key expectations is to look at your culture and see how that's changing. So I think really it's a question of governance, really. You're thinking about, okay, any cultural shift has to sort of come from the board and go down, and you sort of talk about tone from the top. And you want the boards to be setting their expectations and setting a risk appetite, and sort of managing and fostering that culture, right? So So I think if they're sort of seeking to strengthen that culture, they need to be shown to take an active sort of approach in managing it. So they should be challenging and discussing and you know, managing those particularly the most important models and those outcomes, and making sure that the key decisions have model risk management factored into them. So we talked about, you know, not just thinking about, you know, does the model add up properly, but also thinking about the uncertainty and making sure that they understand what the model is capable of, what's it limited by, you know, what are any of the assumptions, or, you know, undermining the quality of the outcome. What are the model's operating boundaries? You know, is it being used for something that's appropriate? Is it currently being mitigated in any way? So does it have adjustments that are being applied after the fact? And just understanding that and discussing, if the model is wrong, what's the potential consequence of that? And so they're making an informed decision, and they're accepting the sort of the risk that's inherent with that, and the potential consequences of it. And that's, you know, that's I think is a key starting point.
Yeah, that's I definitely agree with that. Maybe as we're already quite far in our webinar, and we always try to be a bit time efficient, maybe two more questions. The first one is, yeah, especially now with all the AI use cases that pop up everywhere, there is obviously a very strong focus on vendor models and third-party model risk management, right? We already briefly touched upon it, but could you maybe summarize what are, say, the responsibilities of both the financial institutions using those vendor models and then the vendors themselves?
Yeah. So I think that is obviously, third-party models is something that is very specifically called out in the new regulation. Also, that combined with other recent regulatory change, particularly around how firms are managing their third-party relationships, is important to consider too. So I guess the thing to point out there is that the responsibility for the use and the outcome, and actually what the end result of the model means, will always sits with the lender, right? So it's on them to take, if they're using a third-party model, to take it and implement it as part of their model risk management framework. So it will mean that I think lenders' requirements will increase, or have increased, and there'll be more challenge back to vendors providing the models, more scrutiny on what the model does and the outcomes. So if we look at what the regulation actually says, it means that the lenders need to satisfy themselves that vendor models have been validated to the same standard as their own internal models. Now, thinking about, you know, from past experience of trying to validate a third-party model, and actually, you know, as a JV organization, that, you know, we do build our own models as well, obviously, and we have our own products that we offer to firms. Now, it can be difficult for a vendor to give everything to the firm that they need to do that. So particularly, they don't necessarily want to give away all their sort of secrecy. There's an IP concern there. They don't want to give all that away, and it may be difficult as well to sort of show and share the data, right? You know, particularly if there's concerns over data security. Or you mentioned AI, you know, particularly when you're using generative AI, is that the data sets that those models have been pulled from is enormous, and is unstructured, and, you know, you don't to understand the provenance and the data quality is something that you can't really do. So it's the thinking about how do you do that? How do you manage that? I guess another challenging point is that because vendors aren't bound by the regulation, and so their sort of own internal standards around model risk controls, model documentation, development standards will differ from place to place. Not to say anything negative, you know, there's, you know, lots of really great stuff from sort of third-party models, but that it's unlikely that their own attempt at producing controls, so documentation, for example, would satisfy, if they send the same model to 10 different banks, that they're not going to satisfy all 10 of those banks, because everyone, you know, even now that we have some sort of central points of reference in the new regulation, you know, the idea being that firms can take the regulation and apply it to their own circumstances means that we see a divergence between firms. And so if you're trying to write something that satisfies all of them, it's a very challenging thing. So there is going to be more request and more requirement. I think, from the firms back onto these vendors to improve the materials that are being sent and to give more information around testing and data quality, and thinking about internal governance and controls.
And do you think there is also a role to play there for, say, APIs or better ways to allow the lender to call into the model to do more fine-grained testing, maybe, or to independently assess?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And any sort of practical solution whereby you can mitigate the vendor can have some of their concerns mitigated. So it might be around that they don't want to share data, for example, because of data security, or if they have PII in there, for example, they don't want to share that. But so something that can be done virtually, or something that the lender can control, where they can look at the data, they can do testing, or they can do some sort of performance testing with their own data, or whatever that looks like. Absolutely. Now that we understand the requirements and we understand the concerns of both sides, there's absolutely a space for that, and that would solve what seems at the moment quite a difficult problem to get over, which is how do you validate something to the same standard as your internal models if you can't see the code, if you can't see the data, if you don't have all the same things. So there needs to be something else that's applied there to be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe a very last question, as someone else would have said, we are now at the end of the beginning of the SS123 journey. So what, according to you, comes next?
Okay, so the first thing is that the PRA have already sort of said to the organizations that are captured under SS123 that they're going to review a sample of the frameworks within the next 12 months, acknowledging that the different firms are at different stages in the process and different levels of maturity. They've also stated that the focus is still going to be on on capital and credit models. They're generally the most complex and most important models that the banks manage at the moment, the banks that have a rating system. And sort of the management and treatment of those can be used to assess and to kind of benchmark how effective the new frameworks are. Obviously, those are relatively mature models and mature sort of systems that they have to control and manage. So that'll be looking across all the principles, but primarily thinking about the governance and how model risk is managed, thinking about development and how that's managed. Is validation effective? And again, where there's a problem, how is that being mitigated? And so it's going to, firms are going to need to sort of to show that, I guess, where they are today versus what they're doing versus where they are in 12 months, and to measure and determine progress. And we talk about some of these more difficult things to measure, like culture. So to capture the evidence around that will be really important. Then also, I think, so currently the scope of SS123 was applied to the larger firms that have the permission to calculate their own capital requirements. Now we know that as the PRA finish the strong and simple framework and the changes in the Basel 3.1, we know that this in some form is going to be applied to the rest of the PRA regulated firms through that strong and simple framework. And so that will obviously that will look similar to the SS123, but it will be applied proportionally in a similar way to the other elements of the strong and simple framework. So obviously that's something that is going to be another big change. There's going to be a lot more work, I think, required to support a lot more firms to get through that.
Well, thanks a lot, Carl, for this great overview of SS123.
Thank you,
As you have clearly illustrated, I mean, it's a new framework, but many of the ideas that we have seen across model risk management seem to be kind of seem to be there. It's going to be very interesting to see how both large and smaller organizations will deal with this and how this impacts model risk management practice in general. So yes, thanks a lot again, Carl, for joining us, and thanks everyone for joining us on this webinar, and hope to see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.